My future mother-in-law is the absolute worst person I've ever met in my life. I'm 30 years old and my boyfriend is 31 and we've been together for 8 months. He's the sweetest and most caring man I've ever met in my life, but the biggest surprise is when I met his mother. I'm a natural redhead, so when we sat down for dinner, she asked me if my parents had the same color hair. And then she proceeds to ask me, does the carpet match the drapes? I looked over to my boyfriend who seemed equally as shocked, but he didn't say anything. And when I didn't respond back, she said, don't worry, I'll ask my son about it later. She then went on to attack my appearance and said my hair was too curly and I really needed to learn how to run a brush through my hair and think about my appearance more when I'm out with her son. And when I lost my appetite, she told me it was a good thing that I'm watching what I eat because it would be a shame if I got any bigger. This was my first meeting with this woman, and as soon as I got into my car, I burst into tears until I got home. I told my boyfriend I needed some time. He went into apology overload, and this started by sending me flowers to my office every day and leaving me messages. He said he spoke with his mom and promised this would never happen again. With this reassurance, I decided to give it another chance. 2 weeks later, he invited me to come to a family birthday party. I met more of his family and they were amazing people. His mother was avoiding me and I had no problem with that. I went to grab something out of my purse when I noticed it was missing. I went and asked my boyfriend and he quickly began to help me look for it. He got this strange look on his face and he quickly went upstairs where I heard yelling and screaming. He came back down with my purse in hand. Turns out his mom took my purse so that she could take my license to run a background check on me. I thought it would be best to avoid all family functions until he insisted I come to a family reunion. I sat at a table with his sister and his cousins and his mom sat down as well. One of his cousins looked like my 12-year-old niece and I showed her a picture and that's when his mom began to laugh. She told me she hopes that if me and her son ever have children that they don't look like my niece. And that's when I blew up on her like a volcano. She tried to play the victim and said I was a horrible woman. When my boyfriend decided it was time for us to leave and she saw something in his hand, she looked at me dead in the eyes and said, "You will never have this ring, you little bitch," and lunged for my boyfriend's hand and grabbed the small box and threw it down the storm drain. Turns out he was planning on proposing and got the heirloom from his grandma at the party. My fiancé went no contact with his mom and that only lasted about a week before she came banging on our door trying to apologize. When I let her in, that's when all hell broke loose because she saw our Christmas tree. She began screaming that I was trying to convert her son to Christianity and that I was just a little whore who was trying to ruin her family. She started running towards my Christmas tree and began tearing off every ornament and throwing them and leaving them smashed on the floor. I have many childhood and family ornaments on my tree that were very precious to me that were all smashed during her rampage. I had to grab her and physically drag her away and she was punching me several times and biting my hand. I had to call the cops. She told the police I was an intruder in her son's apartment and I attacked her. After my fiancé came home and he was siding with me, that threw her into another rampage. When the police asked if I wanted to press charges, I looked at my fiancé and he was conflicted. I had to do what made me feel safe, so I decided to press charges. She was taken to the hospital and then arrested upon her release. Him and the rest of his family want me to drop the charges against his mom since I have a restraining order. He said he'll stand by me and my decision, but doesn't want to see his mother go to prison. I'm so confused and conflicted on what to do.
This is why skipping detention might be a good idea. When I was in high school, I slacked off a lot. My junior year, my math teacher was pretty upset by this. Once during a parent-teacher meeting, he told my mom that I wasn't doing as well as I could and called me lazy. My mom agreed and stated that she wouldn't blame him if he pushed and punished me to work harder. From this day on, he did exactly that, always questioning me before anyone else and always sat next to me during exercises. This is when my classmates started realizing that he was a little obsessed with me and started teasing me about it. Right before Christmas break, he threw us a surprise party with chocolates and mock champagne. He poured me an extra glass and congratulated me for doing better. I drank the first glass he gave me, but not the second because I'm diabetic and had already had too much chocolate. During the next class, I felt extremely sick and almost fainted. I spent the rest of the day in the nurse's office and chalked it up to eating too much candy. A few weeks later, I failed a math test. He became extremely angry and yelled at me in front of everyone. The look in his eyes chilled me and I cried. He gave me detention but scheduled it hours later than the usual time and said he would personally be there as well. When I showed up, it was getting dark already and I noticed I was the only student there. Something felt off and a feeling deep inside my gut was pushing me to skip. Right when I decided to skip, I look over and see him walking towards me. Part 2 of why skipping detention might be a good idea. As he walked towards me, I was getting nervous. I told him that I had an emergency and I had to go, but I would email the school and reschedule later. Right after this, I ran off. As I was running away, he yelled at me and told me that I had to obey him and come to detention or he'd call my parents. At this moment, I didn't care. The feeling in my gut kept growing, so I sprinted to the bus and went home. I was afraid that he'd call my parents, but my parents greeted me normally when I got home, so I assumed he didn't. The next day, I was expecting to get an earful, but he wasn't there, and as weeks passed, he never came back. Then a shrink came to our class and asked if he'd like to talk about our math teacher, but no one knew why. Fast forward a few years later when I became a teacher and started chatting with my coworker. I mentioned his name, speaking to her about my weird, bizarre teacher and how I skipped detention. That's when one of the oldest workers there went pale hearing his name. It turns out a few days after I skipped detention, my math teacher was arrested for downloading child you-know-what from the dark web. He also had tons of snuff videos doing terrible things to children and teens. Now I always wonder what would have happened if I hadn't followed my gut instincts and stayed for detention that day with just me and him in that classroom. Story time of how my neighbors were killed and we all heard. I live in a middle to low class neighborhood in the Caribbean. It's a quiet place where nothing happens. It's the type of place that people go to retire and sip pina coladas all day. However, a few houses next to mine lived a family that was not like the rest. They had the biggest house on the street and lived luxuriously. Their kids would play with me, especially the smallest girl we nicknamed Tiny. Tiny was my best friend and she was always at my house. On Tiny's birthday, her parents threw a giant party for her and all of the neighborhood kids were invited. They had bouncy houses, water slides, and everything a kid would want to play with, but my parents wouldn't let me go. I never knew why. I suppose it was because my mom didn't know her mom. After the birthday, things went back to normal, and one day we were all playing and talking about what our parents did for work. We asked Tiny and her siblings, but none of them knew what they did except that their dad traveled a lot and was always at meetings. I didn't pay much attention and we all continued on with our day. One night, we were playing on the street when we started hearing loud pops and screams coming from Tiny's house. I will never forget that day. The neighbors, including my mom, came out rushing us inside yelling that it was gunshots. She locked us inside the house and I couldn't believe what happened next. Part 2 of how my neighbors were killed and we all heard. After hearing gunshots, we stayed locked in my house while the next door neighbor, who was a cop, ran towards Tiny's place. Then we saw a black van rushing down the street trying to get away. Tiny and her siblings wanted to check what was going on, but everyone forbade them to go. All I remember was a bunch of cops and ambulances a few minutes later, and after that day, I never saw Tiny or her siblings again. For a couple months, the house sat empty, but black vans and strange men kept coming into the neighborhood. They went door to door asking for any information about the man and his children. No one in the neighborhood spoke about it, and as years passed, the story faded away. Now that I'm grown up, I asked my neighbor the cop what went down that night. He said that night, Tiny's dad got a gun emptied in his skull and his wife was gravely wounded, but she survived. Apparently, he was a drug lord that was going to make a deal with the police to turn in rival gangs and some other people to the cops. The men in the van that were going door to door wanted to know where his kids and wife were to also shut them up. Tiny's oldest brother was found dead in a neighboring town, his car set ablaze. Tiny and her siblings are now living in other countries under witness protection programs. I just hope wherever she is, she's doing okay and her family got the help that they needed.
Okay, this is going to be a quick story time about why I started making kitty cat keychains. A couple months ago, I was leaving my favorite metaphysical shop when I passed a random guy on the sidewalk, didn't really think anything of it until I got to a crosswalk when I couldn't cross because there were cars coming. The guy caught up to me and was standing about a foot in front of me. He was probably a foot taller than me, not wearing a mask. He proceeded to ask for money, and I said I didn't carry cash because I didn't have any cash on me, and he proceeded to get closer to me. He only backed off once he realized that my key was in what I call ready to stab position, and I'm assuming women watching this know what I mean when I say that. Once I was able to cross, I basically ran the rest of the way to my car with him yelling obscenities behind me. I got in my car, locked the doors, and basically just cried. I know I may not have been in any actual danger, but I was scared for my life at one point. This made me want to look into better forms of self-defense. I'd been working with resin for a little while when I found this mold, and I thought they'd be a really good form of self-defense and also pretty cute. I'll be honest, I feel a lot safer when I'm even just walking through a parking lot now that I know I have this on my person at all times. I also want to do a little bit more of an informational video on kitty cat keychains, so if you have any specific questions or any questions at all, feel free to leave them in the comments. Story time on my psycho roommate from sophomore year. Sophomore year, I was doing random rooming. I set up a group chat with the girls of the room I was planning to move into, basically just an intro text and telling them that I have a cat, seeing if they had a problem with that. I immediately heard back from my now friend Liv telling me she also has a cat, so obviously she had no problem with it. The third roommate also had no problem with it. So the three of us continued to get to know each other for close to a month. And that's when we finally heard back from our fourth roommate. Let's call her Jenny. Jenny told us she was allergic to cats, so we had to move. She told us she was an international student, so she had priority over the room. Keep in mind, both of our cats are ESAs registered with the school, so they're covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So technically, we had priority over the room. We told her that we wanted to live together and it made more sense for one person to have to move rather than 2 or 3. But she kept making up excuses of why she wouldn't move. On move-in day, we found out why. Her boyfriend lived in the dorm next door and she wanted to be able to keep an eye on him. There's a lot more to the story and I hate doing this, but this is definitely going to need more parts. So part 2 will be posted tomorrow. Part 2 of my psycho roommate. So when we finally moved in, we found out that her boyfriend lived next door. And when I say next door, like, she definitely knew what she was doing when she picked this room. So we were able to see his front door through the peephole in our front door. One of the walls in our common room was connected to their common room, so we could hear anything that was going on there. And another one of the walls in the common room was connected to his bedroom. So a lot of nights, if she heard somebody coming down the hallway, she would look out the peephole to make sure that he wasn't bringing another girl home. And there were multiple occasions where she put an actual cup up to the wall to hear what was going on in their common room and in his bedroom. She would also go into our room so she could look out our windows, which would see into his room. They were extremely on and off, so it was hard to always know what was going on between them. But one time she told us that he broke up with her, telling her that she makes him want to unalive himself. But the next time her relationship came up in conversation, she pretended like that never happened and everything was completely fine. So in a word, I would definitely class their relationship as toxic. Part 3 of my psycho roommate. So this is just going to be little things she did that were kind of concerning towards the beginning of when we lived with her. So first off, there were some people that were concerned when I didn't mention me or Liv's cats in part 2. Both of us still brought our cats to school, and they lived with us. And once we got to school, she showed no signs of allergies. And I would know what the signs are, considering I'm actually allergic to cats. This next thing, I didn't actually experience it, but Liv did, and she told me about it. So I think I was in class one day, and Liv was just in the room, and she heard, screaming coming from Jenny's room. She could hear Jenny throwing things around her room, crying and yelling. Still to this day, we have absolutely no idea why. Another thing that was slightly concerning was, at one point, I learned that one of my friends knew her boyfriend, because they lived together during, a summer program. So he knew both Jenny's boyfriend and Jenny. I was talking to Jenny, and I was like, oh, my friend knows your boyfriend. She got so serious, looked me dead in the eye, and said, do not talk about me with people. Again, I have no idea why. My